So in the last video, we looked at different ways that Christians and non-Christians interpret Genesis chapter 1. And we're going to start talking about models in the next video. But before we do, let's talk about what I mean by models. So when you grew up, if you grew up going to Sunday school like I did, then you've heard of some of the stories that we find in the opening chapters of Genesis many times. So you've heard about Adam and Eve, and you've heard about Noah and the flood. And I would argue that when you heard these, you basically just heard them as stories. So maybe your Sunday school teacher, like mine, used these flannel board representations. So you can see a flannel board representation of Adam and Eve, for example. So Adam and Eve are basically one-dimensional. It's got an apple representing the fruit, and as the talking snake in the garden, we've just got a regular snake. And something similar with Noah and his ark. We see modern animals that are associated with Noah's ark. But these are just stories. In other words, they're taken from the Bible, and they're not models. So these stories didn't incorporate science. So if you're a scientist, you can start asking a lot of questions like, are Adam and Eve members of Homo sapiens? Or are they some other species? Is the fruit really an apple? Is the snake, is it a particular species of snake? Is it a poisonous snake or a non-poisonous snake? How could the snake talk? What language was it talking? Was it speaking? What language did Adam and Eve understand? Or about Noah, you could say, well, does this mean that if rainbows showed up after the flood, were there no rainbows before? Did it not rain? Or did Noah really take zebras and lions and giraffes in their modern form on the ark? And so on and so forth. So I want to differentiate between these flannel board representations of the stories in the Bible and actual models. So a model is just an attempt to explain phenomena in a way that is as comprehensive as possible and makes sense of as much of the data as possible. And for Christians, you're going to have two slots as you build a model of origins. You're going to have a slot for science. So these various models are going to take scientific data and they're going to interpret it in different ways and to different degrees. And then as Christians, they're also going to have a slot for scripture. So they're going to take the data like we talked about in Genesis 1 or the story of Adam and Eve or of Noah, and they're going to interpret those different passages of scripture in particular ways. So for Christians together, the science interpretation and the scriptural interpretation build the two foundations of their model. When we build these models, as we plug in on the scientific side, there's a couple of important disciplines and topics that every model needs to account for. So this is just a short list of them, but the model needs to account for the history of the universe and where stars come from, and the solar system and how it formed. It needs to account for geology, like the history of the earth and plate tectonics and volcanoes and earthquakes. In paleontology, it needs to account for the fossil record. Where did dinosaurs come from, for example? Where did they go? In biology, what about mechanisms of change? So all of the models are going to assume that animals can change, new species can arise, but the question is how? And what can we learn from genetics and inheritance that are going to provide clues as to how they change or how quickly they change? It's also going to have to, the model is also going to have to answer questions stemming from archaeology and history, because those disciplines provide data. We've got ancient writings and tools and temples and archaeological ruins that need to be accounted for. And then there's the history too, the history of writing or the history of domestication or the history of cultures or of language. So these are some important topics that models need to account for. And similarly, there's important events in the Bible that need to be accounted for. So I've just listed some of the ones that we'll mention in the next couple of videos. So chapter 1, like we saw last video, needs to be accounted for. What are the days? How long are they? What's going on with Adam and Eve and the fall and Garden of Eden? What about the flood? Was it global or local or symbolic? What about these genealogies of people living 800-900 years? What's up with that? The Tower of Babel, is that how languages arose? What's going on with that? And then they all basically end with Abraham. In other words, all of the models assume that by the time we get to chapter 12 and the appearance of Abraham, the world is kind of as we know it now with modern species and processes. And so we're really just accounting for the world from creation up to Abraham. So these models mostly focus on the first 11 chapters. As we build models, there's lots of different data points like we saw just a minute ago. So you might need to account for Genesis if it's a Christian model, and then scientifically things like fossils and genes and anatomy and so on. So these models are going to handle these data points differently. So Some of them are going to accept or like these data points. You're going to incorporate them into their model. Other data points, they're not sure what to do with, so maybe they ignore it or they criticize the veracity of those data points, or maybe they put them in the trash or the recycling bin. So just as an example, maybe a scientist isn't a Christian, so he takes fossils and puts them here, and because he's not a Christian, he puts Genesis in the trash bin. He's not sure what to do with genes. That one went in the question mark bin, and then anatomy and geology go into the model. So the point here is the models take these different data points and put them into different bins. So some of the models are going to like and incorporate some of those aspects, while others are going to ignore or question the validity of those aspects. So all the models are a little bit different. So what are the models? What are the models that we're going to learn about in the next couple of videos? So I've separated them into two categories. So there's a non-Christian model we're going to talk about first, and I've called that atheistic evolutionism. So basically this is the idea that there is no God, there is no supernatural, right? And so if someone doesn't believe in God, and then therefore they're not going to believe that the Bible is useful, so they're going to put Genesis 1 into the recycling bin, and they're going to focus on science. Christian models, three main models: progressive creationism, evolutionary creationism, and young earth creationism. And progressive creationism is going to say that God created over long periods of time and evolution doesn't really happen. Evolutionary creationism is going to say God creates through evolutionary processes. Young earth creationism is going to say that God created in 24-hour days, and it's going to deny a lot of the science that we've seen so far. It's going to deny the Big Bang or an old universe or evolution. So again, we'll talk about these more in the future, but I wanted to just point them out now so you know where we're going. I'll point out some similarities and differences. So all three of the Christian models are going to be in agreement on these points. So they're all going to agree that God created everything, even if they disagree on how he did it or when he did it. Because they're Christian models, they're going to agree that humanity sinned and continues to sin, so we're all sinners. They're all going to agree as Christian models that the consequence of sin is separation from God, and that can only be reconciled through faith in Jesus. So again, they're all Christian models. At the same time, they're going to disagree on some of these aspects. They're going to disagree over the how and when of God creating. They're going to disagree over Adam and Eve as historical persons, or even what species Adam and Eve were. They're going to disagree over whether there was death before the fall or not, whether the flood was global, and so on and so forth. All right, and those disagreements are going to stem in large part from this last point. The models are going to disagree because they disagree about the relationship between science and the theologies, and science and theology, I'm sorry. So in other words, they're going to disagree over the role of how do we take data that's not in the Bible, like the speed of light or dating methods or fossils, and how do we apply those to our theological systems and our interpretations of the Bible. And so that we're going to see a lot of differences there. Because of these differences and similarities, here I tried to make a Venn diagram. I don't know how well I did this, but the point is that all of these models are going to overlap in some areas. So there's things they're all going to agree on, but then there's big chunks that they're going to disagree on. So atheistic evolution obviously is going to say that there is no God and the Bible isn't worth listening to, whereas the Christian models are going to disagree, and they're going to say there is a God and we should take the Bible into account. Evolutionary creationism and young earth creationism don't overlap a whole lot, but progressive creationism kind of lies as a middle ground between these two views, and that'll become more clear in future videos. But at the same time, I want to recognize that progressive, evolutionary, and young earth creationists are all Christians, so they all believe in God and Jesus, and atheists are going to accept atheistic evolution. So again, the disagreements between these three different types of creationism are in-house disagreements. In other words, it's Christians that are disagreeing over how to interpret science in the Bible, but they're all still Christians. I also want to point out, sorry, I skipped a slide. I also want to point out that when it comes to these models, we can separate the proponents of the models into practitioners and promoters. And what I mean by that is practitioners are practicing science. So they're usually scientists that have some sort of PhD or advanced degree. Their approach to the model is scientific, meaning they're trying to build a model and they're trying to respond to data and interact with it. The practitioners are going to promote dialogue, so they're going to have discussions with people that don't agree with them. And when they write books or articles, they're really speaking to other practitioners because they're engaging in the scientific enterprise. Promoters are folks that have more of a sales approach to their model. So maybe they don't have as much scientific training, and their approach to the model is more apologetic. They're defending it. They're defending their theological positions, and they tend to attack folks that disagree with them, and they don't really see it worthwhile to enter into dialogue with people that they think are wrong. Their primary audience is also laypersons. In other words, they're just kind of trying to distill their information to the general public, and they're willing to take shortcuts to simplify or to reduce the complexity of their models. So just as an example, here are practitioners of the young earth creationism model. So Todd Wood and Kurt Wise, they both have PhDs, and they participate in a group called the Creation Biology Study Group. So in other words, they're trying to build a model of young earth creationism, and their primary audience is other scientists, especially young earth creationists, but anybody that would be willing to have dialogue with them. Contrast them with these promoters of young earth creationism. So Kent Hovind and Ken Ham. And so Ken Ham runs Answers in Genesis. So this is more of an apologetic ministry, so to speak, that promotes young earth creationism, and their primary audience is Christians that already agree with them a lot of times, and they're trying to basically promote their models in a way that defends their model and that criticizes people that disagree with them. And I don't mean to pick on young earth creationists. There's practitioners and promoters in all the models, but this was just an easy way. And maybe you've heard of Ken Ham, but you probably haven't heard of the other guys. All right, and so I mentioned that all of the models have their own practitioners and promoters. And as we move forward, when I talk about the models, I'm really relying on the work of practitioners. So I'm relying on people that are engaged in model building that have a scientific background. So I'll pull from the promoters as well, but these are some of the practitioners of the three Christian models, and you can click on these links in the PowerPoint to learn more about the organizations that represent the three views. All right, we'll pick up with the next video by talking about atheistic evolutionism. See you next time.